Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of January of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And of course, we're going to start with one of the most important, one of the most active, one of the most interesting front line for today, and I'm talking about Zaporozhye area, about this area. When talking about the Western sources map, as you can see, there are a lot of icons. There are a lot of icons of bombs, there are a lot of icons of AK-47. All these icons have just one meaning: the Russians are attacking in this area. But when talking about the Russian sources map, as you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. There is an icon above Lapkovaya, the town, small town that's located on the east from Kamyanska, or Male Sherbaki, Sherbaki, Novoandreevka, Novodanilovka, Takmala Takmachka, Bilogorye, another icon on the east. That means that the Russians may have some progress in this area. So as you can see, the Russians have activated the Zaporozhye front line. When talking about the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, today they told that as a result of effective clashes and effective storm actions that the Russians made yesterday or during the previous 24 hours, the Russians established control over the small village by the name of Lapkovaya, this one. And also the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of heavy clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 90 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and something around 3 artillery systems. They lost Akatse, howitzers D-20 and D-30. As you can see, there is an icon showing about the losses of Ukrainian artillery system. And we haven't received any more updates after the ministry report update. But later, during the day, we start receiving one update after another, mainly from the soldiers on the ground, mainly from the Russian soldiers on the ground, mainly from the military specialists from the Russian side, and they were saying that the Russians attack all over the front line, and that during this day, the Russians managed to establish control over every single town we just discussed. So it's a collapse of the Orekhov front line. It's not just like, if it's true, first of all, if the Russians were able to establish control over Lapkovo, Male Sherbaki, Novodandreevka, Novodanilovka, Mala Takmachka, Bilogorye, that means that the Ukrainian front line near Orekhov has been collapsed. Yesterday we discussed the situation on these two front lines like Orekhov and Gulyai Pole, and I told you that there are at least few options what happening there. And the first one is that Ukrainians are that they are ready, that there are a lot of Ukrainians on the north and they're just ready to start their own offensive operation in this area, but they're not doing this because they're waiting for some order, or they're waiting some results of the Ramstein meeting about the Western weapon and so on. And another option is that if the Ukrainians were forced to move a lot of forces in direction of Artyomovsk just to slow down and stop the Russians there. And some military experts are saying that Ukrainians were forced to move a lot of forces, a lot of tank brigades, a lot of mortar brigades, a lot of artillery system, a lot of armored vehicles, soldiers, very nice specialists, and of course those redeployment of Ukrainian forces from Zaporozhye in direction of Artyomovsk made this part of front line very weak. If you remember, during the previous months, the Russians made a number of reckoning combats in this area. The first town that the Russians managed to establish control over was Dorozhnyanka. We discussed this town just a few videos ago. If you remember, right before the new year, the Putin visited the south military region, and the Russian commanders decided to make some kind of reckoning combat. As a result of that attack, they established control over this town. Yesterday, we discussed that the Russians, as a result of clashes near Orekhov, they managed to establish control over a number of checkpoints. And as you can see today, the Russians pushes all over the front line. And this is very important, and you need to understand that all this attack in the south of Ukraine, in the Zaporozhye area, completely connected with the Western support. Now let's go back to the Western sources map, and I'll try to explain to you what is the real reason of the Russians attack in this area. As you can see, there is a river Dnipro, this one. And there are not much places where the Ukrainians are able to move their Western tanks, Western weapon, and to supply the Ukrainian army that located in Donbass. Let's go from the south. When talking about Kherson, the bridge in this area are destroyed. When talking about Novokakhovka, there is a Russian position there, so highly unlikely that the Ukrainians are able to cross this river. The next place where the Ukrainians are able to use to supply and support the forces in Donbass is the town by the name of Zaporozhye. There are at least a few bridges, railroad, and just a regular one, and Ukraine uses this area to move as much as possible reserves army forces in Donbass. The next town, the next place that Ukrainians uses for these purposes is Dnipro. There are also a lot of bridges in this area, and this is two main logistic hub for supplying and supporting of forces in Donbass. And the next town is small town near Dnipro is Kamyanska. There is a railroad, there is a dam as well. The next place is the town by the name of Kremenchuk. There are also a few railroads, not a dam. And then there is a Cherkasy, Kaniv, and Kiev. So as you can see, there are not much places. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 places that Ukrainians are able to use to supply and support the Donbass forces that located in Donbass. And the Russians understand that if you were able to see the list of Western support that were announced during the previous days, this support list is... I don't have any word how to describe the number of forces, the number of vehicles, the number of everything, the importance of this support. And the Russians understand this as well. And the most important thing that the Russians understand, that this is not the last support, and this is just the beginning. And a lot of Russian sources and Western sources are saying that no matter the position of Germany, United States of America, and Britain, and so on, anyway, sooner or later, the Western countries will start supplying and support Ukraine with the tanks, Abrams, Leopard, and maybe furthermore, they will start supplying support to Ukrainians with F-16. If you know the Dutch, I believe, not the Dutch, the Netherlands authorities reported that they can discuss the possibility of supplying Ukraine with F-16 airplanes. So the situation is critical for the Russians, and they understand that they have a small window. We understand as well, and they understand as well, that the United States of America and Western countries have already deployed all this list of support in Poland. All these tanks, all these Bradleys, all these Strykers, all these, French tanks, and many other equipment, Czech tanks, all of them are already, all these forces are already in Poland, in Czechia, and so in Romania, and so on. So they don't need time to, let's say they sign this list, and then in the months they will start supplying support to Ukraine. No, these forces they are already on the front, let's say on the border of Ukraine. And of course, it's not a one-day situation. Anyway, the Russian military experts are saying that we will see all this Western weapon, somewhere by the beginning of March. So the Russians have just a month, I'm talking about February, and let's say 11 days or 12 days of January, before all this equipment gets the front line. So that's why the Russians need to find a solution how to cut the supply roads, and not even to cut, the most important thing, how to block. And of course, the best solution for this is to move along river Dnipro River, and to try to establish the front line along the river. And the Ukrainians, nobody at this stage of special operation, nobody are able to cross Dnipro River. It's very difficult. It is very difficult to do. It's not impossible, of course, but it is very difficult to do. So that's why the Russians understand that they need to cut these railroads. And when talking about this operation that we see today, we discussed that there are two powerful fortifications. The first one is Orekhov fortification, and the second one is Gulay-Polye fortification. And the Ukrainians, I'm not talking about Velika Novoselovka, it's completely different front line, South Donetsk front line, and I'm not talking about Kamyanska, this one. This town is split into parts, and this is some kind of buffer area, and this town falls automatically as soon as Gulay-Polye and Orekhov falls. And as you can see, according to the Russian sources map, the Russians attack all over the front line in this area, from the east, from the south, from the west, in direction of Orekhov. They want to encircle this town, and for these purposes, they need to do at least a few things. First of all, of course, they need to establish control control over small towns: Stepovoye, Malые Щербаки, Щербаки, Novoandreevka, and furthermore Novodanilovka, another town, Malaya Takmachka, Bilogorye, and when talking about the Russian source map, according to information we have by like 7 p.m. of the local time, the Russians have already done this. One important note: it is very difficult to prove or disapprove this information, and maybe it's some kind of speculation, maybe it's some kind of Russian tactic to make panic on the front lines and so on, and maybe all these towns are not taken by the Russians, maybe they're just very heavy clashes and the Russians are like on the outskirts, on the edges of these towns. Anyway, we need another 24, maybe 48 hours to see the real picture. But when talking about this front line, the main attack is not in direction of Щербаки, Malые Щербаки. No, all these towns are very important because if the Russians are able to take this town, they will be able to establish, let's say, fire control over Orechov. But the most important direction is direction along fields between Guляй-Поле fortification and Orechov. This one. As you can see, there is an icon showing that there is some progress, and the Russians are saying that they have progress around 4 kilometers in this area. Not just in this area, but all over the front line. So the main attack that the Russians want to develop is to attack, let's say, from Novokarlovka in direction of Charivne and then in direction of Novosilovskaya or Guляй-Polskaya. This attack will allow the Russians to cut the supply road that connects Guляй-Поле and Orechov. If the Russians are able to take control over this town, as you can see, there are no local roads. By the way, there are some local roads in this area, some with very low quality. But anyway, I believe that if the Russians do like this, that means that they know what they're doing. So if the Russians are able to penetrate this area and to establish control over this road that connects Guляй-Поле and Orechov, this is going to be like a catastrophe for the Ukrainians because they won't be able to supply and support these forces from Guляy-Polе. And then the Russians, of course, need to turn to the left and try to encircle Orechov from the north. And I believe this is exactly what they want to do. Furthermore, don't forget about another road, N08, this is a very highway, another railroad in this area. So anyway, even if the Russians want to establish control over Orechov, first they will need to encircle this town, and then they need to cut these roads. And after that, they will be able to encircle this group, and maybe then they will start some storming. I believe if we're talking about classic offensive operation, and I believe if we're talking about needs that the Russians need from this offensive operation, they don't need to storm Orechov. They need to block this town. They need to use the same tactic that the Ukrainians used in Kharkiv area. They don't need to storm this town. They need to encircle them, to block them, and to move further. Then another town. Encircle, block, move further. Encircle, block, move further. Anyway, sooner or later, all these towns will be taken. In a month, in a two, these towns will be taken. Don't stop and don't slow down. Move, block, move, block, move. Move, block, move. And the main thing that the Russians need to do, as you can see when talking about Zaporozhye and Dnipro, there are several railroads. This one that moves to Donbas and another from Zaporozhye. The thing that the Russians need to move as far as possible to the north. I'm not sure what exactly the Russians are able to achieve, but they need. This is like the general plan. This is exactly what they need. This is exactly how they need to do this. And if they do this, meanwhile, the Ukrainians in the process of redeployment, I believe that the next days we're going to see, maybe even tomorrow, some kind of rocket and artillery attack just to destroy the Ukrainian energy facilities and not to allow them to redeploy their forces, or at least to slow down. It's necessary in this purpose because you need to understand that when talking about Zaporozhye, there are a lot of forces. Let's take a look at the deployment map. You're going to see that there are let's say 110th Defense Brigade, there are 102nd Defense Brigade, there are 108th Defense. There are a lot of soldiers of Defense Brigade. Some mechanized brigade, 65th at least when talking about this area. Another 56th Motorized Brigade. There are forces in this area. As you can see, there are no artillery systems in this area. The Ukrainians were forced to redeploy these forces, these artillery systems somewhere in Artyomsk. I believe that there are some regular parts of some brigades with artillery systems, but as I understand, it is not enough to stop and slow down the Russians. The main problem of Ukrainians in this area is the lack of armored vehicles, tanks, and artillery systems. There are a lot of manpower, a lot of meat, a lot of soldiers with AK-47, with machine guns and so on, but there are lack of armored vehicles, there are lack of tanks, there are lack of artillery systems, and all these things, there are lack of it. And this is the main problem. And the Russians want to use this situation because no matter how many soldiers are there, even if there are a million of Ukrainians, I believe it's not an easy job, even with a million army, to fight against, let's say, 1,000 tanks. It's just like a comparison softly, of course. Don't pay attention to this, but just I want you to understand the point. There are a lot of forces, but there are a lack of armored vehicles, because all these parts were redeployed to Bakhmut just to slow down the Russians. And don't forget that the Russians continue pressure on Seversk and Bakhmut front lines. And another important thing, when talking about Bakhmut, one more time, I remind you one more time, we're talking about clashes between regular Ukrainian army that were trained in Britain on the territory of Ukraine, no matter, and Wagner's, the mercenaries. I'm not saying that they're bad. Anyway, I'm just the real point I want to give you is that they're fighting not with the regular army. But now, when talking about Zaporozhye, the Russian regular army started their activity, and this is very important. Don't forget that a few days ago, the Gerasimov, the head of Russian headquarters, were appointed to position of head of special operation. Now he controls everything: the headquarters, the army, the air forces, the infantry, and so on. And the most important thing, that this is not the final of this situation. This is not the only thing that the Russians want to achieve. We just discussed that the Russians want to cut these railroads, but when talking about the global scope, it is not enough. As we discussed, there are at least 7 places where the Ukrainians are able to cross Dnipro River and support Donbas and Donbas forces. There is Kremenchuk, Kamyansk, Cherkasy, and Kiev itself. So by cutting these two areas doesn't give a lot. Of course, it reduces the Ukrainian possibilities of supplying and supporting of their forces, but it's not. This attack doesn't solve the main problem of supply and support. The cost of logistic will be increased on the Ukrainian side, but anyway, we know that logistics are completely paid by the Western countries. All expenses are paid. So what does it mean? That means that, at least as I understand and as I see, the Russians need to do another attack from, let's say, this area in direction of Kaniv, in this area. So this might be a possible another solution, another attack. And with this attack, the Russians need to cut another 2 roads on the north. Let's say that moves that are heading from Kiev and Cherkasy, this one. And from this moment, there are going to be just one place where the Ukrainians are able to use to cross the river, and this is Kremenchuk. Also, the logistic expenses will be increased, but the Russians won't be able to solve the main problem of this supply and support. So what the Russians are able to do in this case? And I believe that if the Russians started from Orekhov or from the Zaporozhye to the north trying to cut these roads, if the Russians start their movement from the north to block Kiev and to block, let's say, Kaniv, Cherkasy, they don't even need to block Kaniv, Cherkasy. They need to just block Kiev somewhere here and to establish their position somewhere like here, like this is the only thing the Russians need, and then to establish their fortification to block the supply and support that goes through Kiev. And when talking about this town in the middle part of Ukraine, Kaniv, Cherkasy, Kremenchuk, I believe that this is the cases when the Russians will make a decision to destroy the bridges with the rockets, with very powerful rockets, missiles. Maybe they're planning to make some kind of special operation, as the Ukrainians did on the Crimea bridge. So Crimea bridge shows us that bridges are not, immortal. They can be destroyed, and these bridges can be destroyed as well. So, and from this perspective, the Russians will save the bridges in the south if they want to use them for further offensive operation in direction of, let's say, this part of Ukraine, they will be able to save the bridge in Kiev and not to create some kind of catastrophe in Kiev that connect between two parts. But these bridges will be destroyed. And after that, it will take just time before the entire Donbas Ukraine army will be collapsed and will fall. Without supply support, without anything, without food, without shells, without ammo, without new manpower. It will take like 2 or 3 months, and after that, there will be not even bullets. There will be no bullets justified in this area. So let's follow Orekhov offensive operation, and of course another option, maybe the things that the Russians did in Orekhov, are doing these minutes in Orekhov, is just some kind of show. They understand that Ukrainians are planning to start on spring their own counteroffensive operation in this area, because, as you know, most of the military experts are saying that the meeting in Ramstein was about to provide Ukrainians more weapon before upcoming counteroffensive operation on the south of Ukraine, Zaporozhye, in direction of Melitopol, in this area. So maybe this is the reason why the Russians want to take Orekhov, want to take Guliai-Polye, just to create a buffer to take Ukrainian fortification trenches and just to win more time. Because if the Ukrainians start, so the thing that maybe the Russians want to achieve is just to improve their tactical position in this area by taking these two fortifications, like Orekhov and Guliai-Polye, and another maybe 10 or 50 kilometers to the north, just to push the Ukrainians as far as possible. And during the next upcoming offensive operation of the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians will be forced to take back these positions, and only after that they will be able to enter the territory that today under Russian control. Now let's talk about other front lines. When talking about Donetsk area, the Russians reported during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainian lost around 60 soldiers and something like 5 armored vehicles and 4 artillery systems, 2 Gazdika, 1 Gyatsint, another D-20 system. When talking about Bakhmut, as you can see, the Russians continue clearing operation. There are still some Ukrainian forces who are hiding in the salt mines, and the Russians continue clearing. There are very heavy clashes in Krasnogora. Another important update about Klishchiivka. Today we received the final confirmation from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation that they established 100% control over this town. Now there are just 1 trenches left, and Wagner's, I believe, they will change their focus, and they will do this in the next few weeks. And when talking about Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Russian sources are saying that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 70 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems, 2 D-20 howitzers and 1 D-30 howitzers. But without any movements on the ground, the only thing that Ukrainians these days trying to return or to establish 100% control over Novosilovska. They want to penetrate this area and to start clashes inside of Kuzyomovka. So for now, we can say that Novosilovska is under 100% control of Ukrainians. If we can talk about the fact that anybody can control ruins, there are no places to hide, but this town, according to information we have, was returned by the Ukrainians. And now the front line is along the railroad, and the Ukrainians tried to cross this railroad as well. I'm not sure, of course, if it's possible. But anyway, let's see. I believe that we will understand soon. So let's follow Zaporozhye one more time. I believe that this is not the last attack. I believe that the Russians prepared at least 3 waves of attack. The Ukrainians did the same, if you remember. They started their offensive operation in Kherson. Then they started in Kharkiv, it was the second, and then they started in Kherson one more time. So when talking about this area, the Russians started in Bakhmut, now the Russians started in Zaporozhye, and I believe that the Russians are planning to start another offensive operation, my projection that maybe on the north, to open another front line and to force the Ukrainians to move more forces to the north, because when talking about Bakhmut, there are armored vehicles, tanks. When talking about Zaporozhye, there is a lack of these vehicles, tanks, but there are some number of these forces. And when talking about north, I believe that there are no armored vehicles at all, or the number of these type of vehicles, tanks are so low, so I don't believe that this can change something on the front line. The Ukrainians, they rely on trenches, minefields, and that's it that Ukrainians rely on this front line, and maybe some artillery systems, who knows. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.